Welcome to week 5 of American government. Have you ever watched the news and heard people say things like,
members of Congress?
Senate Republicans have picked up 2 seats.
Heads to the House for a vote there.
Just rolled out from the Senate.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she believes the House will pass a nearly $500 billion stimulus package.
Have you ever wondered what the heck are they talking about? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at this week. Cue the intro.
Whatever happened to predictability? The milkman, the paper boy, evening TV. You miss your old familiar friends, but waiting just around the bend. Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a heart, a hand to hold on to. Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a love of somebody who needs you. When you're lost out there and you're all alone, a life is waiting to carry you home. Everywhere you look, everywhere you look.
God, man, I miss the 90s. Last week, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, our first form of government in the United States. This week, we're going to move on to the new document, the Constitution. Throughout the next chunk of the course, we're actually going to take a look at the Constitution piece by piece and break it down. So let's start off with Article 1. And Article 1 is about the legislative branch, so the lawmaking power of the government. One of the first issues that popped up at the Constitutional Convention was the issue of how people would be represented in their government. The framers knew they wanted a Republican form of government where there's representation, not a direct democracy. Now, up to this point in your academic career, when you think about government, you probably think, sure, that's great. We live in a democracy or a republic where there's representatives that represent the people and they elect those representatives. But it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that. For example, how many people do those representatives represent? And is that fair? How often are they elected? How old do they have to be? Do they have to be from the United States? There's a lot more questions that go into figuring this out that the founders had to answer. At the Constitutional Convention, there were some different ideas as to how to represent the people of the United States in this new legislative lawmaking body. One of the plans was from New Jersey, and it was nicely titled the New Jersey Plan. Under the New Jersey Plan, things basically stayed the same way they were under the Articles of Confederation. Every state essentially got one vote. It was equal representation for all of the states in this legislative body, and there would just be one house. The big states did not like this New Jersey plan. They wanted to change things up. States like Virginia, which had a huge population, said, wait a second, if we've got most of the country's population within our borders, then we should get to send more representatives to this legislative body. Small states didn't really like that because that meant they would probably always be outnumbered by the representatives from the big states. And the interest of the small states would always be lost to the majority of the bigger states. I mean, let's think about it on a microcosmic scale, like here at CTEC. Let's say CTEC created a council of representatives from each lab that got to vote on what people had for lunch on Fridays. They made representation proportional to the size of each lab, meaning the bigger labs get to send more representatives to this council to vote on what people get to have for lunch. The biggest lab at CTEC is clinical care. I mean, that's kind of fair, right? After all, there are a lot of students at CTEC that are here for clinical care. And since that's a sizable chunk of the student population here, they should get the most say in that. But if you're a smaller lab here at CTEC, then you're not going to get as many representatives, which means that your lab isn't going to have as much of a say in that decision. That means clinical care representatives are going to have the biggest say in that decision. And I imagine as future healthcare workers, they would choose healthier options than perhaps the rest of you may like. But on the flip side, if all of the labs were to have equal representation, that wouldn't necessarily be fair to the bigger labs since their student population represents more of the school population. Or they should kind of have a bigger say since they're impacted by the decision. Such was the dilemma at the Constitutional Convention. So these two plans were set forth. The New Jersey plan, which called for equal representation in just a single chamber of legislators, and then the Virginia plan, which called for representation to be based on a state's population. And it actually called for a bicameral legislature. That means there's two chambers of people that vote on stuff. Both sides had really good arguments, but then Connecticut comes out of nowhere and says, whoa, hang on, guys. I've got the compromise of the century. In fact, it becomes known as the Great Compromise, where essentially they combine both plans into what we have today. With the Great Compromise, a House of Representatives was created where each state's representation is based off of its population. That means the bigger a population is in a state, the more representatives they get to elect to this House of Representatives. The Senate, on the other hand, was also created in the Great Compromise, and in the Senate, there's equal representation. Every state gets 2 senators. So Article 1 starts off kind of describing these 2 chambers of what's called Congress. Whenever someone says Congress, they're referring to both the House and the Senate as a single entity. Don't forget that, because some students sometimes get confused and think Congress is different than the Senate and the House. Congress simply means both together. It's a lot easier to say Congress than the House of Representatives and the Senate. So let's take a look at the lower chamber of Congress first, the House of Representatives. Remember, I said representation in this House is based off of a state's population, but you got to figure out how many people live in a state first before you can figure out how many representatives they get to send to the House of Representatives. This is done every 10 years in what's called a census, and a census is actually constitutionally mandated. You may have seen things in the mail this summer that were sent to you and your family asking you to fill out the census. That gives the government information, just generally speaking, on the population and the demographics. The census asks things like, what is your age? What is your race? How long have you worked at the particular company you're at? How much education do you have? Do you have any kids? By the way, you may want to remind your parents, if they haven't filled out the census yet, someone's probably going to come knocking on their door here within the next few months. Don't worry, it's not a cop, but it'll be a census worker who will then ask those questions just like they used to back in the day before they had mail and technology to do it online. In fact, if you want to, you can see census records from 70 years back and farther. So you can actually find like your great-great-great-great-grandparents, see where they lived and find out what their occupation was and who all was in their household. For genealogists, it's one of the top ways they figure out when people were born, how old they were when they died, and who their family was. So anyway, after they count up how many people live in a state, they report that number to the state government. Then the state legislature, which would be like the state's House and the state Senate, they form a committee, and that committee draws up the state into different districts. And each of these districts has to have about an even population in it. In Ohio, it's about 800,000 people in each district. Now, why does it have to be evenly populated? Well, think about it. If you're one of 800,000 people, your vote matters a heck of a lot less than if you were in a district with 10 people, because then your vote would be 1 of 10. Your vote would carry more weight. It would be more valuable than if you lived in a district where there were a heck of a lot more people. So dividing the state up into evenly populated districts means that everyone's vote in the state carries about the same weight. The people within each district then get to vote for a representative to represent the people of just that district in the House of Representatives. You can see all of the House of Representatives districts in the United States on this map here. It kind of looks like someone took red and blue paint and just threw it all over a map of the US. California there has 53 districts because they're the most populated state. That means they get to send 53 representatives to the House of Representatives. Wyoming that you see there, the entire state is one district. That's because Wyoming only has a population of about 1 million people. So they literally get to send one person to the House of Representatives to represent the entire state. They're one of the few states that actually has more senators than members of the House of Representatives. And again, that's all based off of a state's population. Now, if you're going to base representation in the government based off of population, you still have one major issue you have to get over: slavery. Some southern states like South Carolina, for example, had slave populations up to 40% of the total population in the state. That's crazy. If the southern states got to count the slaves towards their population, that means they would get to send more representatives to Congress to actually fight for pro-slavery legislation. This terrified the North, plus they thought it was totally unfair that these people weren't treated as citizens, yet they were being counted towards their state's population. So the North and South fought back on it in the Constitutional Convention, and some of the southern states like South Carolina threatened to not ratify the Constitution unless they got to count their slaves towards their state's population. There's South Carolina being a butt again. So the North and South compromised and said that for every slave in a state, they would count as 3/5 of a person towards that state's population. Then Article 1 goes on to talk about the qualifications for running for the House of Representatives if you want to be one of those representatives. To be representative in the House of Representatives, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have lived in the United States as a citizen for 7 years. You have to be a resident of the state, and actually more specifically the district in which you are representing. You serve 2-year terms with an unlimited number of terms. And there are people in the House of Representatives that have been in the House since like the late 60s or the early 1970s. So you're elected every 2 years. That means you serve 2 years, then you're up for re-election again. The constituency is a district. That's a portion by a state's population. That's from that map that I just showed you. The organization, it's more governed by rules. It's formally structured. There's more power to individual leadership positions, which we'll talk about here in a second. Now, this last part is really important to remember. The goal of the House is to be closer to the will of the people, to the voters' preferences. Why? Well, this, at the time the Constitution was created, was the only part of government that was directly elected by the people. As we'll learn later, back in the day, people did not vote directly for senators, and still to this day, you do not vote directly for president either. Shocker? I know, right? We'll talk about it later. The House of Representatives with the 2-year term cycle means that if you make a really bad decision the people don't like, your re-election is coming up very, very quickly. They'll be able to vote you out of office before you know it. You're on a very short leash. So ultimately, the House of Representatives was meant to be more representative and responsive to the will of the people. Now, there are some leadership positions in the House of Representatives you should know about. Let's start with the Speaker of the House. They're kind of the top dog of the House of Representatives, and the current Speaker is Nancy Pelosi. The Speaker of the House gets to really set the legislative agenda for the week. And that's a lot of power, because if you want to vote on a particular law and the Speaker of the House doesn't really think it's important or doesn't like it, they'll shuffle it to the bottom of the agenda and you may never see it again. Speaker of the House can also facilitate debates in the House of Representatives, and they have a gavel. They can bang it and yell order if things get unruly. That reminds you of the British Speaker of the House of Commons, although our House of Representatives is far more well-behaved than the British House of Commons. The Speaker of the House also gets to decide when things are voted on, which is, again, a lot of power. The House of Representatives is also split up into committees, where each committee kind of specializes over a certain lawmaking policy area. So for example, there's an education committee, a science and technology committee, a transportation committee, a healthcare committee. The Speaker gets to choose who heads those committees. And you better believe the Speaker's going to choose people that are of their political party. So since the current Speaker is a Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, most of the committees are headed by Democrats, which means most of the legislation coming out of those committees are written by Democrats. Then there's the majority leader, who kind of serves as the number 2 person under the Speaker of the House. And they help the Speaker of the House kind of lead the political party that's the majority in the House of Representatives. Oftentimes they'll serve as a spokesperson for the party. There's also a minority leader who does the same thing for whichever party is the minority in Congress. Then there's the majority whip and the minority whip. And both of them go around to their respective parties to make sure that they have enough votes on a particular issue. They try to see where everyone in the party stands on something, then they report back to the party leader. They've also been known for sternly suggesting that everyone in the party be on the same page. For example, they may tell someone, hey, listen, if you don't vote with the rest of the party on this particular issue, we might just tell the Speaker or the majority leader that you don't belong on that committee you like anymore. So you kind of get the idea of why they're called whips. You know, they're supposed to whip the party into shape. Interestingly enough, the majority leader, minority leader, majority whip, and minority whip are not mentioned in the Constitution. They're kind of just customary practices that have evolved over time. The only leadership position mentioned in the Constitution is the Speaker of the House. Now, the House of Representatives has some exclusive powers or some special privileges and things that only they can do. For example, one of their special powers is that all bills that generate revenue have to start in the House of Representatives. That means if you're going to create a new tax that's going to raise revenue for the country or put a tariff on foreign-made goods, that bill has to start in the House of Representatives. Now think about that. Why would they give that power to the House of Representatives? Now, if you said, gosh, Mr. Lucas, it's probably because the people that wrote this document had experienced a tyrannical government taxing them out the wazoo to the point where they started yelling no taxation without representation. So they probably said, you know what, let's give the power to tax to the body of government that is most directly representative of the people and is closest to the people, so they can change it quickly if they don't like it. If you said all that, you're right. All they ever wanted King George and Parliament to do was give them taxation with representation. And that's what the House of Representatives does. It's the one part of government that was actually directly elected by the people. So it was directly representative of them. And that's the one that they gave the power to at least start any bill that would generate revenue through taxes. The next big power the House has that's exclusive to them that we're going to go over is the power to impeach the president or Supreme Court justice. A little later on in the Constitution, in Article 2, it says that the president can be impeached and removed from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Although it doesn't really say or define what high crimes and misdemeanors actually mean. The framers left that purposefully vague so that future generations, through their House of Representatives, would have some flexibility there to try to remove a president for something that, I don't know, who knows? Maybe they just forgot to put in the Constitution at the time. Every year, one of the biggest misconceptions students have is over what impeachment really is, what it really means. But I'm hoping your class, more than any other I've had before, will really understand what it means because, in case you didn't pay attention to the news last year, your president got impeached. Impeachment means the president is being charged with a crime. Now, being charged with a crime doesn't necessarily mean that you're convicted of a crime. For example, if someone accuses you of breaking into their house and stealing something, oftentimes the police will charge you with the crime, but then later on, a jury of 12 people will decide if you're actually guilty or not guilty of that crime. If the jury says that you're guilty and they convict you of the crime, then you are punished. If the jury acquits you of the crime and says that you're not guilty, then that means you can just go on, be free, and continue doing what you were doing. And that's kind of how the impeachment and removal process of the president with Congress works. If representatives in the House feel like the president has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, then the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives will issue articles of impeachment. The committee will then draft those articles and vote on them. If it gets approved, then it goes to the entire House of Representatives to debate and then vote on. If a simple majority, that means 51% or more of the House of Representatives, votes in favor of those articles of impeachment, then the president is impeached. But that doesn't mean the president is kicked out of office. That doesn't mean the president is removed from office. Hey, did you know that impeachment doesn't necessarily mean that the president is automatically removed from office? Oh, no, man, I had no idea. I never paid attention in my government class. Some idiot that made these really lame videos, and I just fell asleep every time. Hey, did you know that that means the president is not necessarily removed from office? Yeah, that's right. An impeached president isn't necessarily removed from office. Now that I think I've gotten my point across, the next step in the process is for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to come into the Senate building where they have a trial in the Senate. The Senate will then decide if the president is guilty or not guilty of the charges that the House charged the president. Here's the catch, though. It has to be by a 2/3 majority vote. So that means 67 of the senators have to vote that the president is guilty of one of the charges of impeachment. And if 67 of them do, then that's it. You're out of here. This is exactly what happened last year with Donald Trump's impeachment. Impeachment charges were started in the House Judiciary Committee, where 2 charges were brought up against President Trump over a phone call to Ukraine. I won't get into all the details of that, but to show you the process, the Judiciary Committee voted and approved of that, and then it went to the House floor. The House floor then debated for a while over the 2 charges of impeachment and then held a vote on it. Both charges of impeachment were passed in the House, which means President Trump was and forever will be considered impeached. After that, the charges then went on to the Senate, where Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, oversaw the trial. And in the Senate, they read the charges, they brought in evidence, they debated about it, and then finally they held a vote. Neither charge was able to get the 67 votes required to actually remove President Trump from office, which means he was acquitted of both charges. That means he was found not guilty, which means he gets to stay in office as president. So he's still technically impeached. President Trump became the 3rd president to ever be impeached. The first was Andrew Johnson, and he was almost removed by the Senate. It failed by 1 vote. The second was Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Yes, that's Hillary Clinton's husband. And then Donald Trump last year. Now, real quick, before we move on to talking about the Senate, I do want to spotlight who your representative is in the U.S. House of Representatives. His name is Troy Balderson. You're probably starting to see a lot of Troy Balderson signs posted all around Lincoln County as his re-election nears. Remember, they have 2-year terms. He was last elected in 2018, which means this fall he's up for re-election. Troy is a Republican and grew up just down the road in Zanesville. He represents everyone you see here in District 12. Troy's actually been to CTEC a couple of times to come in and talk to government students, and if it's allowed this spring, I'll try to get him to come in and you guys can ask him questions about his job. Now, because Troy grew up on his family's farm in Zanesville, his father owned an auto repair shop. He also grew up working on cars. Troy is on committees that are more specific to his knowledge of expertise. He's on the House Committee on Agriculture, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the House Committee on Small Business, and the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. All right, let's move on to the upper chamber of Congress. As the upper chamber, the Senate is more elite. It was intended to be more insulated from the emotions, the passions, and the whims of the people. If the House of Representatives is a broken down old common pickup truck, then the Senate is a Lamborghini. Under the Constitution originally, no one directly voted for senators. State legislatures voted for senators. So that means you could directly vote for your state legislatures, the people in, let's say, the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, and then they would vote for the U.S. senators to represent that state. So basically, there was a bunch of well-educated, rich, wealthy middlemen to make the decision. This changed in 1913 when the 17th Amendment was passed and allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators, which is why now, when you go to vote, you can directly elect your U.S. senator to represent the state. So now, thanks to the 17th Amendment, the middleman is gone and the people can directly vote for senators, which some people don't necessarily think is a great thing. Now remember, the Senate has equal representation, so every state gets 2 senators. There's 50 states. That means there's 100 senators. That's a lot less compared to the 435 that are in the U.S. House of Representatives. Senators are elected every 6 years, and it's staggered so that 1/3 of them are up for election every 2 years. But that gets kind of confusing. So all you really need to know is that senators are up for re-election after 6 years. That means they have a much longer leash than representatives in the House. That means it's 6 years until the people can hold them accountable. But the founders didn't want direct democracy or anything that looked like it. So they didn't want both of these branches to be representative of the people and to be in lockstep mirror images of one another. So the Senate's definitely more elite. Don't believe me? Take a look at the requirements listed in Article 1 to be a senator. You have to be at least 30 years old. You have to have 9 years of citizenship in the United States. You, of course, have to be a resident of the state that you're representing. They have 6-year terms. Again, they're divided into 3 classes that are staggered with an unlimited number of terms. So you could be a senator up until you're 100 years old if you wanted to. They represent the entire state. That's important to remember. That's a big distinction between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Senators represent the entire state, which is a lot bigger group of people to represent. They're less governed by rules in the Senate. There's more power to individual members. It's a little bit more informal than you would see in the House of Representatives. As we're about to see, they don't really have a Speaker of the House in the Senate. And again, they're more insulated from the public. They don't really represent the will of the people as much as the House of Representatives does. As for leadership, well, the Senate doesn't have a speaker like the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives. Instead, it has someone called the President pro tempore, and that's basically someone that kind of facilitates the debates that go on in the Senate. In the Senate, really the top person is the majority leader. So right now, the Republicans are the majority party in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell is the majority leader. So he kind of drives the agenda and decides when things are voted on, things of that nature. There's also, just like in the House of Representatives, a minority leader that's kind of the spokesperson for the Democrats in the Senate right now. And there's also majority and minority whips that do the same thing that the majority and minority whips do in the House of Representatives. The Senate also has some really special powers. First of all, whenever the president signs a treaty, it has to be ratified by the Senate. That means it has to be approved by the Senate. You might famously remember Woodrow Wilson's Treaty of Versailles being rejected by the Senate, which meant the United States did not become part of the League of Nations after World War I. So a more modern example would be like if President Trump signed a peace treaty with Iran, then that treaty would have to be ratified and approved by the Senate. The House is not involved in the process at all. According to Article 1, the Senate also has the sole power to confirm or to reject presidential appointments to either the Supreme Court or the rest of the executive branch, the president's cabinet. So if President Trump wants to appoint a new person to be in charge of the Department of Education or the Environmental Protection Agency or the Federal Communications Commission, that person would have to be approved after a vote by the Senate. Usually the Senate invites the nominee in and they'll ask them questions to try to get an idea of what they're going to do once they're in charge of that certain department in the executive branch, which is in charge of carrying out certain policy agendas in certain policy areas. Then they'll decide if they like that person, they'll vote for him. If not, they'll vote against him. If a simple majority votes for him, congratulations, they have the job, they're in charge of that department. And that's pretty important because those cabinet heads in the executive branch are in charge of determining how the law is actually implemented and executed. As I mentioned too, they're also in charge of approving or rejecting potential Supreme Court nominees, which again is pretty important because as we'll learn here in a few weeks, the Supreme Court, they're appointed for life. So if a judge makes it onto the Supreme Court, they're making rulings deciding if something is constitutional or not constitutional for the rest of their life until they decide to retire. Now, because of that, whoever the president picks to be a Supreme Court nominee gets drilled pretty hard. The Senate has what's called hearings, just like they would with cabinet heads, where they really drill these Supreme Court nominees with tough questions and try to figure out how they're going to rule on certain issues in the future, like abortion and gun rights. I famously remember Justice Kavanaugh's hearing, which was pretty intense due to some sexual assault allegations a few years back. Lastly, the Senate does have one more really unique power that's not actually found in the Constitution, but has just kind of over time been practiced. It's called the filibuster. A filibuster is when someone is called on in a Senate debate and they never stop talking. I mean, literally, they don't stop talking. It goes over into the next day. The reason they're doing it is to try to delay a vote on a bill from occurring. Usually it's a bill that they don't like. They want to generate national attention about this particular issue. And they also hope that by delaying the vote on the bill, that the bill gets shuffled back into the agenda and has a hard time making its way back to the top of the agenda. During a filibuster, you are not allowed to sit down. You can't leave and go to the bathroom.
But I've discovered that there are some limits to filibustering, and I'm going to have to go take care of one of those in a few minutes here.
Or leave and go eat, because the moment you sit down or leave, then the floor is yielded back to someone else, and then they can proceed and move on and get the vote started. The record for the longest filibuster ever was by Senator Strom Thurmond back in the 1950s, who went 24 hours and 18 minutes straight talking. They had to give him a steam bath while he was talking. There have been some more famous filibusters in the last decade. For example, Rand Paul was filibustering American drone policy, and he actually went so long he did have to snack during his filibuster. Senator Ted Cruz also had a famous filibuster over the funding of Obamacare. In fact, on that one, I'll just show you the highlights.
In support of defunding Obamacare until I am no longer able to stand. Most Americans could not give a flying flip about a bunch of politicians in Washington. Who cares? What the American people care about is their own lives. On a Saturday or Sunday morning when your dad's making pancakes, it is very cool when he can like flip them and make them do a flip high in the air and catch them. He also, I will credit my father, he invented, this wasn't for the restaurant, but he did it anyway. He invented green eggs and ham. I don't believe there's been a day on this Senate floor that I haven't worn my argument boots. I took the coward's way out. And so went and purchased some black tennis shoes. I am not in my argument boots, and I'll confess, I really do feel embarrassed by that. If you will forgive me, I want to take the opportunity to read 2 bedtime stories to my girls. I do so like green eggs and ham. Thank you, Sam I am. Note folks in the gallery who just waved, I'm not sure if they do have their electronics. Well, if you tweet, it may end up here and I may have the chance to read it. I want to point out just a few words of wisdom from Duck Dynasty. Redneck rule number 1. Most things can be fixed with duct tape and extension cords. Now, I will say standing here after 14 hours, standing on your own feet, there's sometimes some pain, sometimes some fatigue that is involved. But you know what? There's far more pain involved in rolling over.
As you can see there in a filibuster, you can talk about anything. You think it's so easy? Sometime this spring, I will threaten the whole class with the quiz, and if you can successfully filibuster the quiz, we won't have it at all. And then we'll see if you think it's that easy. And that's pretty much the Senate for you. By the way, your two U.S. senators that represent the state of Ohio, Sherrod Brown, who's a Democrat from the Mansfield area, and Rob Portman from the Cincinnati area, who's a Republican. Remember, both your senators, Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown, represent the entire state of Ohio, everyone in Ohio. And thanks to the 17th Amendment, you can now directly elect them. Rob Portman's not up for re-election until 2022, and Sherrod Brown's not up for re-election until 2024. And just like in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, there are also legislative committees that Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown are both on. They're assigned to those committees by the party leaders in the Senate instead of the Speaker of the House. So like the majority leader and the minority leader will assign them to the committees. The last part of Article 1 we'll take a look at is how a bill becomes a law. And I'm not going to teach that to you. I'm going to let Schoolhouse Rock take it away.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign, and if he signs me then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will, but today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so old.
By that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes!
And that is how a bill becomes a law. It's a really slow and difficult process. I love how Senator Chuck Grassley, the president pro tempore of the Senate, described it.
Debated. This legislative body needs a function, a laxative. Legislation needs to circulate through this body in the usual form, like food through your body.
Remember, the founding fathers that wrote the Constitution in Article 1 here wanted a limited government. They didn't want government passing a whole lot of laws, because for every law government passes, it increases in authority and power. So if they did pass a law, the framers wanted to make sure a lot of people agreed with it. So yeah, actually the framers did want the House and Senate to be constipated. That's probably a sign I should stop. Anyway, for your assignments this week, you've got these two ed puzzles, which are both due on Wednesday. And then, of course, as you're probably starting to figure out each week, you have either a Google form or a CTQ that is due on Thursday. On Fridays, make sure you take a look at the previous week's feedback. I do write comments in your Google Slides. Take a look at the rubric, see what I wrote in there. Feel free to comment back to me if you want. Spend some time doing that on Friday or at other points throughout the week. As always, if you need anything, let me know, and have a great week.